The rancher just wanted a place to sleep. But those women had other plans. The wind shifted low across the dry hills, rolling in like a forgotten hymn. It was the kind of dusk that wrapped the prairie in quiet. Sky burned orange, shadows falling long from crooked fences, and the last stubborn wheat stalk still standing. Out here in the far stretch between nowhere and memory, time didn't tick. It whispered. Samuel Crowley rode a horse too thin for the journey, and wore a coat too torn for the wind. Dust clung to his boots, his beard, his silence. He hadn't spoken since the river crossing 3 days back, not because there was no one to talk to, but because he no longer trusted his voice to mean anything. His eyes were heavy, as if sleep had left him behind years ago and never looked back. He wasn't riding towards something. He was riding away from everything. As the last of the sun melted into amber, he spotted it. A broken barn resting near a stone ridge. One side collapsed in, but the other still held. Smoke rose from a chimney that looked recently used. No dogs barked. No horses were tied. Just the faint scent of firewood and cooked beans. Samuel dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg, a limp he'd picked up from a fall in Colorado and never cared to fix. He didn't knock. He didn't shout. He just stood outside the wooden door, hat in hand, like he had in towns where kindness had long dried up. But before he could move, the door creaked open. There they stood, 2 women, one older, her hair in a tight braid, streaks of ash in the black. The other younger, maybe 19, holding a cast-iron pan like a shield. Their eyes didn't flinch. "Don't mean no harm," Samuel said, voice gravel thick. The older one didn't speak. She looked him over like she was reading the weight of his hunger, the ache in his joints, the guilt beneath his silence. Finally, she stepped aside. The rancher entered, not like a man claiming shelter, but like someone borrowing air. Inside, it smelled of lentils, wood smoke, and lavender. A candle flickered on a crooked table. Blankets had been folded with care. There was a stillness in the room, not hostile, but watchful. A teapot hissed softly near the fire. "Name?" the older woman asked, her voice rough like the ridge winds. "Samuel," he said, "just looking for a place to sleep." The women said nothing more. The door closed behind him, and in that moment, something unseen passed between the three. Not trust, not fear, but a quiet agreement. The wind outside moved on, but inside, something else had just begun. The night settled into the wooden walls like an old secret, soft, uninvited, familiar. Samuel didn't ask for more than the wooden floor, but the younger woman, her name, he would learn later, was Clara, dropped a folded quilt beside the fire without saying a word. She didn't look at him, only at the coals, as if warmth was safer when it wasn't shared by name. He laid down slowly, hat beneath his head, boots still on. The quilt smelled faintly of pine and something older, maybe lemon balm or rain. He pulled it up to his chest and stared at the flicker of flame light dancing on the ceiling. Neither woman spoke much, but they didn't sleep either. Around midnight he heard a cough, not deep, but sharp, a wetness in the sound. The older woman, whose name still hadn't been spoken, pressed a cloth to her chest and leaned forward, bracing herself on the table. Her hand trembled. Clara went to her, eyes full of worry too old for her years. Samuel sat up. "Water?" he asked, voice low. Clara hesitated, then nodded. He found the tin jug on the counter without being told, filled the chipped cup with a stillness that said more than help ever could. She accepted it without thanks, but not without recognition. He saw it then, the band of bruising just above the older woman's collarbone. Faded, but not forgotten. A bruise that curved like a noose and healed like a warning. She caught him noticing. Their eyes locked. No one spoke. Later, when they thought he was asleep, he heard Clara whisper, "We shouldn't have let him in." "He didn't ask," the older one said. "He knocked without knocking." Samuel closed his eyes. Just before dawn, the fire grew dim. Clara had curled up beside the hearth. The older woman, Ruth, leaned in her chair, upright but asleep. A grey shawl had slipped from her shoulders. Samuel rose quietly, careful not to wake them. He found another blanket in the basket near the rocking chair. It was thin, hand-stitched, the kind made by someone who believed warmth was a kind of memory. He draped it over Ruth, one edge tucked just beneath her chin, and then he sat beside the door. Not to leave, not to intrude, but to listen. Outside, a coyote howled somewhere near the ridge. The wind moved like a sermon no one wanted to hear. Morning cracked open slow. He boiled the tea again, toasted the last 2 pieces of cornbread near the fire, left it on the table without a sound. When Ruth stirred and saw the food, she didn't speak, but her hand touched the edge of the blanket. She ran her fingers along the stitching, and then, only then, did she look at him with something that wasn't suspicion. It was tired grace. Samuel never asked what they were running from, never asked why the barn had no animals, why Clara flinched when loud wind hit the window, or why Ruth's eyes stayed fixed on the door after every creak. He didn't ask, because he already knew. Maybe not the story, but the shape of it. And he chose to forget the road that had brought him there. 2 days passed like fog drifting across the hills. Slowly, shapeless, and without asking permission. Samuel stayed. No one told him to, and no one told him to go. He fixed the split in the barn roof without being asked. He fetched water from the frozen creek. When Ruth coughed, he warmed her tea with molasses, the way his mother once had. He never asked why they stayed in a house with no animals and no locks. But the answers began to surface anyway. Not in words, but in the things they tried to hide. Clara, the younger one, always stared too long at the horizon, like someone afraid of being found by something they couldn't outrun. A burn scar looped along her left wrist, circular, deliberate. Her palms were calloused, not like a farm girl, but like someone who once scrubbed floors that weren't hers. One night, under the hush of a crackling fire, Ruth spoke. "Clara wasn't born here," she said. Her voice was gravel, but her tone was clean. "She was bought." Samuel said nothing. His hands were wrapped around a chipped mug. He didn't flinch. "She was 13, taken from her father after he sold off the land and the livestock and decided his daughter was all that was left." Clara didn't look up. "They sent her to a man in town, a butcher with a clean coat and a dirty house. He beat her for spilling milk, cut her hair with a boning knife, locked her in a cold cellar for weeks." Ruth paused. Fire snapped. She escaped, barefoot, in winter. Still, Clara didn't speak, but her shoulders curled inward, not in shame, in remembering. "I found her half dead near my fence, took her in, and I haven't let her go since." Samuel leaned forward, slow. "And the man?" he asked gently. Ruth's jaw tightened. "Still lives in town, owns 3 shops now, talks about charity from the pulpit on Sundays." Silence wrapped around them like an unwelcome guest. "Does anyone know?" he asked. "They know," Ruth said. "They all know. But that town's built on silence and Sunday dresses." Clara finally spoke. One soft sentence. "He carved his name on my shoulder once, so I'd never forget who owned me." The way she said it, flat, hollow, like it was no longer hers to feel, made Samuel set his cup down like it was suddenly too heavy. That night, he stood outside long after the fire went out. The moon was low, swollen with secrets. He looked toward the road that curved back to town. The butcher would be sleeping in a warm bed, maybe praying before it, maybe telling himself stories. Samuel closed his eyes. The next morning he built a latch on the front door, silent, precise, not to lock the women in, but to keep the world out. And when Ruth tried to thank him, he simply said, "Some things need protecting." She nodded, not in agreement, in understanding. Snow came one morning, soft and uninvited, like a secret returning home. It clung to the porch railings, softened the barn roof, and hushed the fields like prayer cloths laid gently over old wounds. Samuel stood outside with a hatchet, splitting logs, when he noticed it a figure far off, standing still near the edge of the fence line. A man, then 2. By sundown, there were 3, silent, not moving closer, just watching. Ruth saw them too. She didn't speak, only closed the curtains one by one and stirred the fire a little longer than usual. Her eyes no longer rested on the flame, but flicked toward the door like it owed her a warning. "They know," Clara whispered that night. Samuel didn't ask how, but he understood. This kind of knowing didn't travel by letter. It traveled by instinct, the way wolves knew when something in the forest had shifted. The next morning, Samuel rode to town, not for answers, but for bread and medicine. The storekeeper, Mr. Finch, looked him over twice, said nothing. but didn't offer to wrap the bread. He placed it bare on the counter. "You been staying up on the old ridge place?" he asked without asking. Samuel nodded. "Thought Ruth passed 2 winters ago." "She's still breathing," Samuel replied, voice calm. The storekeeper gave a tight smile, but his eyes hardened. "Some folks don't forget. Some don't forgive." Samuel held his stare. Some never see the difference. By the time he returned, someone had left a bundle on the fence. A dead squirrel, its throat slit neatly, belly sliced open. A message dressed as a warning. Clara buried it without a word. Ruth stood beside her, lips moving in silent prayer. That night the animals came closer. A fox circled the barn. Owls perched on the chimney. Horses from the neighboring farm neighed long into the cold. The wind groaned through the trees like a hymn missing its final verse. Samuel didn't sleep. He sat by the door, rifle across his lap, not loaded. In the morning, tracks circled the property, not paw prints, boots. "They want her back," Ruth said, standing beside him. "They never had her," he replied. "And yet still, they came. Not shouting, not storming, just standing near the edge of the trees. Men in thick coats, arms crossed. Boys on horses. Old women with folded hands. Even the preacher, with his white collar and grey beard, stood like a monument on the hill. Not a mob, not yet, but a congregation. Waiting. Watching." Samuel turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Clara sat braiding a rope of dried lavender and string. Hands steady, heart not. Ruth stirred a pot of stew like it was the last warmth in the world. "Whatever you choose," Ruth said, "we'll follow it." He looked from her to Clara. The firelight caught on the healed edge of Clara's scar, and something in Samuel shifted. Not into anger, not into fear, but into stillness, like the weight of a promise being carved into the bark of time. It happened on the 5th night. The watchers had not left. They no longer spoke, but their presence deepened, like fog that wouldn't lift. Even the stars seemed to hesitate above the cabin, flickering uncertain. Inside, the air was thick with quiet. Clara sat near the fire, her knees tucked beneath her. Ruth slept lightly in her rocker, one hand still curled near her heart. Samuel stood by the window, staring at shadows that moved but never approached. And then Clara spoke. Her voice was so soft it felt like breath escaping a wound. "I tried to go back once," she said. Samuel turned. "I walked all night. Thought maybe if I went back and obeyed, things would be easier. He said he'd stop hurting me. Said I'd earned my place if I just learned." Her voice cracked. I believed him. She looked up, eyes red-rimmed, not from crying, from holding it in too long. "I stayed for 3 more weeks. I cleaned. I cooked. I stopped speaking. He stopped hitting, but he started locking the door. He called me his wife, said Ruth had kidnapped me, said God wanted me to submit." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "I left again when he slept," she said. "Ran barefoot. Cut my feet on glass. I bled across the road for miles." She paused, then whispered, "But the shame wasn't the bruises. It was that I ever went back." Samuel stepped forward. "Shame don't belong to the one who was chained," he said. "It belongs to the hand that held the chain." She broke then, not into sobs, but into a silence so deep it shook her bones. Her shoulders folded, her hands trembled, and the firelight caught on something in her eyes. Not fear, not grief, relief. She didn't expect comfort, didn't beg forgiveness. She just offered the truth like a wound turned outward. And Samuel, the drifter, the rancher who had once lost everything and called it justice, he knelt beside her, not to rescue, but to surrender. "I left someone too," he said. "Years ago, my wife. She begged me to stay when the land got hard, but I blamed her for what the sky stole. I walked out with more pride than sense. Been riding ever since." Clara looked at him, stunned by the fracture beneath his calm. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a coin, silver, dulled by time. "It was hers," he said. "I've been carrying it. Not for luck, for punishment." He placed it in Clara's palm. "Now it's yours, to spend, or bury, or forget." She closed her fingers over it, not tightly, just enough to let it matter. Outside, the wind eased, and for the first time since they met, Clara said his name. Samuel. Just that. And it changed everything. By the 7th day, the watchers had thinned. One by one, The silent figures by the ridge began to fade back into the hills, not because they were satisfied, but because silence could not feed outrage forever. Samuel had packed his saddlebag that morning. He thought his part in their story was done. He had given shelter, silence, and a coin once meant for penance. The quilt was folded near the hearth. Ruth had nodded without words. Clara had said thank you with her eyes. But just as he opened the barn door to saddle his horse, they heard it. The sound of wheels on frostbitten dirt. A wagon. Clara froze. Ruth dropped her ladle. Samuel stepped outside and saw the man long before the wagon stopped. The coat was too clean, the gloves too soft. The eyes, cold, entitled, hadn't changed. Not in years. Joseph Barlow, the butcher. He didn't come with rage. He came with a scroll in hand, neat, official-looking. He stepped down slowly, brushing dust from his collar as if filth couldn't touch him. "I've come for what's mine," he said, standing before the porch. Clara remained inside. Ruth stood at the door, her hands folded, not in prayer, but in refusal. Samuel stepped forward, not in anger, in anchoring. "She's not yours," he said calmly. Joseph held up the paper. "Legal guardianship, church approval, witnesses. You think hiding her here changes what's on record?" "She is not a record," Ruth said, voice low. Joseph smirked. "You've poisoned her. She ran back once. She'll run again. They always do." And then Clara stepped out. No apron, no braid. Just a worn shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders and her scar exposed beneath the collar. She didn't look scared. She looked tired, like someone who had finally run out of room for shame. "I did come back to you once," she said softly. "But I didn't stay. Not because of Ruth, not because of Samuel, but because you made me believe my pain was my fault." Joseph blinked, caught off guard by the steadiness in her voice. "You didn't break me," she said. "You just taught me what a cage looks like. So now I know what freedom feels like." He stepped forward. Samuel did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood between them, not blocking, but bearing witness. And that was when something changed. From the hills, the preacher stepped forward. Then Mr. Finch. Then the neighbor boy on his mule, his father behind him. They had come not to fight, but to watch. Now they were hearing. Joseph looked around and saw no fire in their eyes, just cold disapproval, the kind that stuck longer than stones. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "No," Ruth said, "but you might." Joseph turned, climbed onto his wagon, and drove off, not with speed, but with something heavier than fear, shame. Clara stood on the porch long after he disappeared from sight. The town had not saved her, but it had listened. And sometimes that's all healing asks for. Winter gave way to early thaw. The snow melted slow, as if reluctant to leave. Crocuses pushed through the mud near the barn. Birds returned before they were expected. Samuel stayed, not because he was needed, because he was welcome. He built a second rocking chair for the porch, same curve, same grain as Ruth's, but just a touch lower, humbler. Ruth didn't say thank you. She simply placed her shawl across the back of it one afternoon, and that was enough. Clara began tending the soil again, quietly, patiently, with hands that had once flinched, now firm in the dirt. She planted lavender near the window. On Sundays, she didn't braid her hair. She let it fall loose down her back. The town didn't speak of what had happened, but their silence changed shape. At the general store, Mr. Finch began wrapping the bread again. The preacher stopped by with seed packets and left them without a word. One morning, a small box was found at the fence post. Inside, a pair of worn gloves, too large for Clara's hands. They had once belonged to Joseph's wife. No note, just understanding. Ruth's cough grew softer. She walked a little farther each week. She spent afternoons reading aloud to Clara on the porch. Her voice, once sandpaper, now smooth with story. And Samuel? He carved something in the barn wall. Not initials, not names. A small coin, embedded deep into the wood, sealed beneath glass. Below it, etched in soft lines, "She stayed." No one asked what it meant, but everyone who saw it paused. One dusk, as the fire burned low and the world seemed small enough to hold in a teacup, Clara sat beside Samuel under the sky. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The stars blinked slowly awake, like memories finally brave enough to return. "I used to think survival was enough," Clara whispered. "Now I think maybe peace is different." Samuel nodded. She placed the silver coin in his palm. "I'm free now," she said. "You don't need to carry it anymore." He looked at it, then at her, then set it gently back inside her hand. "No," he said. "It's yours now, not as weight, as proof." Clara closed her fingers around it. Not tightly, just enough to let it rest. That night, the wind didn't howl, the barn didn't creak, and the fire didn't die out until morning. And the world, without a single gunshot or grave, learned how to change, just by choosing not to turn away.